Hi, welcome to another episode of the Carolyn Glick Show. A little bit later in this podcast, I'm going to be joined by my friend and colleague from the Center for Security Policy in Washington, Dr. David Wurmser, and we're going to talk about the ongoing revolution in Iran and what's happening there, and also about the implications of Iran's expanded alliance with Russia that's been announced and we've really seen implemented over the past several weeks in Ukraine. But before we do that, I want to talk about specifically what's happening here in Israel. And obviously, I'm sure that all of you guys have been watching the wranglings in the coalition talks between Netanyahu and Likud and Shas and Aryeh Deri and the national, the religious Zionism party leader Bezalel Smotrich over who gets what portfolio in the incoming government. But I want to talk about something else which hasn't gotten a lot of attention, which is that it's very clear that with the inauguration of this government, Israel will move very swiftly to a constitutional crisis, the likes of which we've never seen before. What do I mean by that? Well, Israel, I've written about it and we've discussed this on the show. We have been in the throes of what you might call a constitutional crisis for the past many years because we have a legal system or a legal fraternity in Israel that encompasses the Supreme Court, the state prosecution, the Attorney General, that has seized for itself powers from the elected leadership of the country in terms of lawmaking and in terms of policy making that it then accepted no limits on, so that we have a legal fraternity and a judiciary that has seized unlimited powers from our politicians. And it manifests itself maybe most blatantly in the Supreme Court having seized for itself the right to abrogate, to cancel, to invalidate lawfully promulgated laws passed by the Knesset on everything from the smallest offenses to constitutional laws, what we call basic laws in Israel that relate to the very structure of our democracy and its foundational workings of the government and of the Knesset and of the judiciary. So we have a judiciary that has seized unlimited powers for itself. On the other hand, we have an incoming government whose members have made it very clear that their primary intention during their tenure in office is to limit the powers of Israel's legal fraternity and its Supreme Court. And the first order of business from the perspective of all of the incoming members of the government, all of the parties in the right-wing bloc led by Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, is to pass a law that will limit the Supreme Court's power to invalidate laws. And like I said, currently that power, which has no basis in Israel's law, but was seized by the justices of the court over the past couple of decades, the incoming government wants to limit it and say, if the court invalidates a law, that invalidation can in turn be overturned by the Knesset in a subsequent law that passes with an absolute majority of 61 in favor out of Israel's 120-member Knesset. So the incoming government and the incoming Knesset majority intends to pass a law that would say to the court, okay, we're not going to take away the power that you seized for yourself, that you can invalidate laws. We're just going to place limits on that power. And that's very reasonable and it's very limited. I would have preferred that they simply seize in return. They restore things to the way that they were before the judicial revolution and deny the Supreme Court any right to abrogate lawfully promulgated laws of the Knesset. But that's not what's on the table. What's on the table is a compromise between my position and what the actual law says and today's practice, which is that Supreme Court justices have seized for themselves the unlimited power to abrogate laws, every law. And what we've seen over the past couple of months from the Supreme Court and from its lackeys in Israel's legal profession, particularly law professors, but also the Bar Association and others, is that the Supreme Court and its allies and its lackeys are lining up their ducks uh, in a way that indicates that if the Knesset passes this law, that we're going to get one of these left-wing good governance NGOs to petition the court to abrogate the Knesset's law, the new law that limits the Supreme Court's right to abrogate Knesset laws, so that the Knesset passes a law to limit the Supreme Court's power, and the Supreme Court will then overthrow the law that limits its power. And that will, of course, plunge Israel into a constitutional crisis, the likes of which we've never seen. And I think, it's important to note why it is that, I'm so concerned that this would happen. And so I'll just give you a little bit of history of the court over the past year or so. So, not the government before the outgoing Bennett Lapid Gantz government with the Muslim Brotherhood, we had a two-headed government that was co-led by Netanyahu and outgoing Defense Minister Benny Gantz. And during the tenure of that two-headed government, things came to a head, a crisis came to a head between the two parties because they couldn't decide what kind of budget to pass. Netanyahu wanted to pass a one-year budget and Gantz wanted to pass a two-year budget. And under Israel's basic law, our constitutional law, for the passage of budgets, you can do either a one-year budget or a two-year budget. And they couldn't come to an agreement on that. So a member of Gantz's party offered a compromise. So why don't we just pass a 4-month budget and we'll amend the law in a manner that enables us to, on an emergency basis, just pass a 4-month budget. And they agreed, and they amended the basic law about budgets in Israel to allow the government to pass, or the Knesset to pass, a 4-month budget. And they did. And after they passed the law, or they amended the basic law on budgets to allow a 4-month budget to pass, the left-wing movement for quality government, which is a movement that has been an active ally to the court in its seizure of the powers of Israel's elected officials, whether in the Knesset or in the government, they petitioned the Supreme Court asking it to invalidate the amendment of the budget law, that 4-month filling a whole amendment, by claiming that it has to be unconstitutional. It's unconstitutional, said the Movement for Quality Government, because it's not being done for a good purpose, just for political reasons. So I don't know. It's a very obviously arbitrary rule that for politicians to do things to enable them to fulfill their duties as politicians, that's not a good purpose. That, of course, is an arbitrary decision or determination by the Movement for Quality Government. In the event, they passed the government, but they passed the 4-month budget, but the government fell before the Supreme Court had a chance to rule on the Movement for Quality Government's petition. But after the government fell, the Supreme Court did issue a ruling. And in its ruling, it said, well, the case is moot because the government fell. So we're not going to invalidate the amendment to the basic law on the budgets because there's no point. The government already fell. But if the government had continued to operate under a 4-month budget and it hadn't fallen, we would have invalidated it because it was a constitutional change for an unworthy cause. So again, they agreed with the Movement of Quality Government that the Supreme Court gets to decide whether the reason that the Knesset passes a law was good enough for the law to be allowed to stand. I think, that the exposure internationally of Israel to extraordinary criticism because our left-wing politicians and our legal fraternity writ large, including our legal academics, are probably going to be leading PR campaign against the government of Israel, not only at home but abroad. And the government, supported by the vast majority of the people of Israel, is going to find itself in a very precarious position internationally, but also domestically, because it's also going to put the court under unprecedented crisis into an unprecedented crisis of credibility because the overwhelming majority of Israelis reject its judicial supremacy and want to limit its powers, which is, reflected by the results of this election. And so we're in for a very, very difficult time, and this is going to require significant wisdom on the part of Israel's elected leadership. We can't expect any from our out of control judiciary and legal fraternity writ large, which is acting hysterically just at the concept that their unrestricted, unlawfully seized powers can in any way be limited or checked or balanced by our elected officials. And they're, of course, screaming in the name of democracy. So we have to look forward in this space to see what happens, whether the government proposes the establishment of a constitutional court, which has been online for some time as a possible solution to this problem, a court that would supersede the Supreme Court or be above the Supreme Court as currently constituted, or some other fix, or or how they would go about interpreting such a decision, a scandalous decision by the Supreme Court. But I think going forward, it's likely that we're going to find ourselves in this sort of a constitutional crisis. And then, at the very least, regardless of what happens, you're going to be able to say that you heard about it here first. So, on that happy note, I want to move to the second part of the show, which is to talk about what I think is the most important international event happening today, more important even than what's happening in Ukraine, which is the burgeoning open strategic alliance between Iran and Russia, and of course, even more importantly, the revolution on the streets of Iran, with the Iranian people working to overthrow the regime of the Ayatollahs. All right, well, I'm pleased today to be joined again by my friend and colleague at the Center for Security Policy, Dr. David Wurmser, to talk about Iran's strategic alliance with Russia and what this tells us about the brilliance of the Biden administration's policy towards both countries, and also to talk, of course, about the Iranian Revolution and the status of it, because that, I think, is really the most important subject that anybody can talk about. But let's lead into it with the issue of the Iranian-Russian relationship. So first of all, thanks so much for joining me again, David. It's always so much fun for me to have you on the show with me.
Thanks. It's always great to be with you, Carolyn, and an honor. Believe me, it's an honor.
Shocker pucker. Anyway, listen, let's talk a little bit about Iran and Russia. They said that they're going to be working together to develop advanced drone and other technologies, I think missiles as well. And this, after a couple of weeks or a couple of months ago, they upgraded their strategic ties with Khamenei hosting Putin in Tehran after Russia invaded Ukraine. So, can you just give me your thoughts on the implications of this strategic alliance, this very open strategic alliance, of course, Russia has been using to devastating effect Iranian drones in Ukraine now for what, about over a month now, right? So give me your sense of the implications of the strategic alliance for the region, for Ukraine, for Israel and the Middle East, and of course for the United States and its policies towards both those countries.
Well, I think, first of all, Israel has for now, better part of almost a year since the invasion of Ukraine, been very careful precisely because there are red lines with Russia. And we know of them more visibly in Syria with the airspace and so forth, but there were also red lines of understanding as to what Russia would be providing Iran in terms of equipment that could compromise Israel's ability to conduct potential preemptive strike or so forth. And I think what you're beginning to see is the Russians are beginning to cross those red lines. I don't think it's any fundamental shift in their attitude toward Israel as much as it is despair on their part. They need the Iranians now. They need them greatly, and they're willing to pay a price for that. And they're not. They don't see the Israeli reaction to be worth that, to prevent an Israeli reaction isn't worth more to them now than to cooperate with the Iranians. So the question I really have is, does this change Israel's calculations to raise the price of what the collapse of the red lines might mean in terms of Iran? So, but in the very least, this represents a great complication for the Israelis, especially if we start seeing Sukhoi 35 aircraft, which we believe they are selling them, and we see hypersonic missiles. And I think that's really the bravado that the Iranians this week did, thumping their chests, that they have developed hypersonic missiles. They have not developed hypersonic missiles, but it's potentially that they bought some. And then more advanced anti-aircraft systems, and then also intelligence cooperation could be deepened to warn the Iranians more about Israeli activities. So there's definitely something changing, and it's very dangerous for Israel. And I think it points again to the fact that whatever Israel's done to stop the Iranian nuclear program, it needs to do more, and it needed to do more already for quite some time.
So when you look at the situation on the ground, that you said it stems from despair on the part of the Russians because of the sanctions, because of the quagmire in Ukraine, because maybe they have indeed adopted the strategy that our colleague David Goldman suggested that they had adopted from the get-go in a previous edition of this show, which is that Putin just intends to devastate Ukraine, depopulate it, destroy it completely. And that seems to be the implications of the warfare that he's been undertaking against Ukraine for the past several weeks with Iranian drones. And so then the question becomes: is there something to be done to diminish the despair on the part of the Russians, and so diminish their interest in deepening their relationship and mutual dependence on Iran?
Well, I think the Russians are at a point where they can't ever really back down, even if there's a ceasefire. This has been a deep wound to the Russian psyche, and they will come back to it. They're not ones to forget in 5 years and move on. It's a culture that is deeply rooted in a unique sense of history, which is that history lives within you. Their identity ties their history within them. Jewish people, we have a similar concept when we talk about Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, for example, the destruction of the temple. It's as if we ourselves experienced the destruction of. Well, that's the same with the Russians. They have a very deep sense of historical identity that time is not as relevant to them as it is to us. Something 100 years ago lives. So I think Ukraine will never go away in the Russian psyche as a humiliation, as a defeat that needs to be addressed and reversed. So unfortunately, I think we're looking at a Europe that is not easily going to ever be really changed. So um, I don't know. I'm a bit worried about what this means for the long term in Europe. It doesn't seem to me that this will just go away. And in that context, I think once again, Israel has to ask itself, how does it navigate that? How much does it really want to get involved is of course, question number one. And what is the overflow of that? And the overflow is what should concern the Israelis the most.
What do you mean?
Well, like Iran, Russia will reach out. Russia obviously has serious trouble. Its economy is not good. Its technology is obviously lacking. This is not a great power anymore, other than its nuclear weapons. So it will reach out to China and to Iran and maybe to other countries to leverage their strength, their technological advantages, their wealth, etc., to survive and to continue to have the sort of outlook that it has. So unless something fundamentally changes in Russia, and Russia has two souls. One is that dark historical soul I was mentioning without giving up its objectives in the long run. But it also has this, we see it with Ivan Turgenev, we see this with all sorts of thinkers along the way. There's also a liberal, sort of European liberal side to Russian culture. And this is going to be battling out, and we can only hope that the liberal side dominates for a while and gives us a breather from the Ukraine war. But under the surface, the other will always be there, and Russia won't have the power or the ability to really confront its own objectives, or to confront on the basis of its own objectives without help from outside. And that comes with a quid pro quo, whether it's the Iranians, whether it's China, whether it's some other revanchist power that threatens the West. They're always going to gravitate toward that when their revanchist, their darker side comes to the fore. So this is with us. This is going to be with us. And again, I think it shows something very important. Strategy is not something based in the moment. Strategy looks ahead. And this is something
But that's
Israel
the
and the West.
problem.
Yeah.
Well, that was just what I was going to get at, because that's the problem. You know, the United States' strategy under the Democrats, Obama and now Biden, was to reach a deal with Iran, to realign the United States towards Iran and away from its traditional enemies. And the Biden administration very vividly was using Russia as a means to achieve that end, so that the indirect negotiations in Vienna over the past year and a half, you know, till they sort of petered out, were mediated by the Russian ambassador in Vienna for the United States. Russia was America's intermediary. And while this was happening, Russia was planning its invasion of Ukraine, and indeed invaded Ukraine. And I think that there were one or two rounds of negotiations that continued on in Vienna after the February invasion of Ukraine, where the Russian was the intermediary in those talks, so that the United States was pro-Russian when it came to coddling Iran, but at the same time, it was waging a proxy war against Russia through the Ukrainians. And um, I don't see the strategic thinking there.
No, there's no.
I see it's a strategic recklessness that has really brought us to this point. And then the question becomes, is there something that the U.S. could do that would change the situation for the better if it walked away from its strategic recklessness and started acting in a strategically prudent manner to clamp down, or to tamp down the flames of war between Russia and Ukraine, and to induce Russia to lessen its desire to work more closely with Iran and, of course, with China.
Well, I'm not sure there's much they can do to sort of tamp down. I think the Ukrainians are going to fight until they restore their territory. I don't think Zelensky can back off on that for various reasons. So I think they're going to go all the way, and it's very difficult for the West to abandon him on that. They did Israel in 1948, obviously, right when Israel was about to really start winning, is when the world powers pulled the plug on Israel. I mean, one forgets that the ceasefire that the British really pushed hard was because they knew that the Israelis were preparing for a massive assault in Jerusalem and would succeed. So they didn't want Jerusalem to fall to the Jewish state, so they imposed the ceasefire. You see a similar thing now with Ukraine, that they kind of do. People are sort of beginning to talk about imposing a ceasefire, but I'm not sure that Zelensky can go for it, and I'm not sure politically that the Biden administration can go for it either if Zelensky doesn't go for it. So I think we're kind of locked into a situation where the Russians are going to be defeated. They're going to have to they don't have the power to really reverse that conventionally. So I think that they're going to, this is going to become a long war. In the long run, though, I think the United States needs to really seriously think strategically. And what do I mean by that? One is that our feeling since World War II that we can, through creative diplomacy, preemptive diplomacy as it became known, and enough intertwined interests, this interdependence among nations, whittle away national interests And as a result, we can create an era essentially of peace. If we're good enough at diplomacy, we can create an era of peace, and war becomes an abnormality, something that doesn't happen if men act properly. And I think what you're going to what needs to happen is America has to return to its more traditional view, which is war is not good. It disrupts us from our lives, but it's an episodic thing that is just it happens. So you prepare for it and you think about it and you think strategically for the long run, not for the moment. The second
Yeah,
thing
I
is
mean, we're definitely, oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say we're definitely not seeing that now because the United
no.
States has supplied Ukraine with almost its entire arsenal of Javelin missiles. So they're even looking at the prospect of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan or other military action against Taiwan. And even if the United States wanted to arm the Taiwanese, it doesn't have the wherewithal to do so because its reservoirs of weapons has been depleted already in Ukraine.
Well, that speaks to the deeper issue that we're in a state of conflict globally, and we're acting as if we're in peacetime. I mean, take for example the Israeli gas. Europe desperately needs gas. Despite what you hear in the press all the time, Israeli gas doesn't have a structure to get to Europe for real. The only structure it has is a very limited one through Egypt. And it's not even sure that it can go through Egypt because Egypt may need that gas for itself and won't let it go forward. So there's really no way to get Israeli gas in any significant quantities to Europe. Well, you'd imagine with Europe's despair and America's intense interest in dealing with Europe's despair that there would be a Manhattan-like project to get Israeli gas, the structures built to get Israeli gas to Europe. And instead, what you see is essentially a kind of a lackadaisical, off the shelf attitude that, oh, we'll deal with it at the pace we would have dealt with it in peacetime. That's just not the way you operate in a state of conflict. With China, whether or not it was wise to send all this artillery, javelins, HMARs, and so forth to Ukraine is one thing, but to not backfill it with an industrial surge that then builds out what we're sending to Ukraine back into ourselves. That is what's astonishing. We're continuing within the framework of our pre Ukraine purchases, our pre Ukraine behavior in terms of defense. And yet, we're in a conflict where we may be in a hot war with China very soon. And we're not prepared. We're running out of ammunition without even fighting yet. To me, this is astonishing that we have the rhetoric and mentality of a nation that's entering war, and yet the peacetime preparation for it that is frankly peacetime. This is,
You had a second point that you wanted to make when I was interrupting
yeah,
you. I don't
the
know if you
second
lost
point
your
is that
train of thought
have
already
to,
or.
we really have to think about our ideas and who really are our allies. Right now, it seems like Western Europe is a great ally because we're fighting Russia and they're on our side and they're sending their weapons and so forth. But in the long run, over the last 20 years, one thing that's been pretty striking is that the fundamental values of Europe are not those of the United States, and that Europe set out for itself a policy. It's one of the reasons why America was seriously weakened in the last 20 years. Europe has set out for itself a policy to be a competing body of values to those that the United States puts forward. And it's not necessarily in our interest to have a strong European Union anchored to, say, France and Germany. It seems to me that you're seeing the rise of very different mentality in politics in places like the Czech Republic and so forth. So there's this divide between old and new Europe, and we have to think very seriously which of them are really our allies.
Yeah,
Uh,
well, that goes to the strategic and frankly national incomprehensibility of the Biden administration. I mean, they are actually. I mean, this is Obama at least seemed to pay lip service to certain American values, but Biden really doesn't. I mean, he has gone all into globalism, wokeness, progressive theologies of American guilt and culpability for everything. I mean, it certainly began under Obama, but Obama had tried to hide his radicalism. The Biden administration does no such thing. So, when you say that they have different values, Lee Smith was on last week, and he said that the Biden administration essentially shares the values of the Iranian Ayatollahs, and I don't know whether that's the case necessarily, but it's certainly the case that Biden's advisors are very similar to the French and the Germans in terms of their globalist attitudes and also their anti-Americanism, frankly. So it's not surprising that they would be advancing policies that are antithetical to American interests. But I think the other aspect of it really is sort of just they're stupid. I mean, they're doing things that are crazy. They're getting rid of America's energy supplies. They're getting rid of America's arsenals, as the war drums beat stronger and stronger from day to day, all over the world.
Well, they're very aggressive in their engineering of circumstances without really properly appreciating the circumstances or the people who are acting in them. So, a good example is the Lebanon Israeli oil agreement or gas agreement. I really believe this administration thought it would help Lapid and Gantz get reelected in Israel. And I don't think there was a single Israeli who put even more than a minute's thought to those agreements. I think they should have negatively put more thought into them. But nevertheless, I don't think a single Israeli voter voted on the basis of that. But I think that there was this perception in the administration here that it would swing the election, which shows you they really didn't understand Israel. And this is a country that is intertwined with the United States. Most people speak English. It's an open book. It's very easy to access Israel, and yet they don't get it. So I think that there's that stupidity, as you'd call it, but there's also the progressive side. I think this administration doesn't even have the veneer anymore or a layer of old school liberals that stand in between sort of the American people and the progressives in the administration, in the very least, just to give a face. This is now a raw progressive administration, and is run increasingly by progressives who don't even necessarily listen to their own president when necessary. Eli Lake is working on a piece. I don't know if he's put it out yet, but it's quite possible, for example, that FBI investigation really wasn't known to the White House, and it shows to the level to which the progressives have taken over the structures of the U.S. government and no longer really need to feel don't really feel they need that veneer of Biden being an old school liberal, maybe extreme left side of the old school liberal, but sort of an old school liberal. They don't even need that anymore. They just proceed. So I think what you're seeing is the summer of 2020 revolutionaries in America, the ones who burned our cities. They are now burning our foreign policy down. And that's terrifying. In that sense, Lee Smith's right. There is some convergence of interest. I don't think they ever really. I don't really think these guys know what the Iranian regime really stands for. So I don't give them enough credit to be deeply invested or versed in the Iranian regime's ideology, but they have a common interest in taking down American power. They believe American power really stands at the center of a global problem, and that
Before
brings them.
we pivot Before we pivot to what's happening in Iran itself, I think that that brings us back to the question of, I mean, when we look at the situation where the United States has clearly lost its marbles strategically or is actually batting for the other side, however you want to look at it, either through stupidity or through subversity. I mean, the real question is, um, for Israel, looking at the increased intimacy and mutual reliance of Iran and Russia on one another, we may very well find ourselves. It's true that it's doubtful that Iran is developing hypersonic missiles, but Russia has them. And then it becomes a question: does that mean, does this increased interdependence of these two countries mean that we have to assume that everything that Russia has may end up in Iran's hand? And if so, what are we to do about this situation? And then when we move into the other question of Iran, I think that this mutual dependence of the Russians on the Iranians and vice versa can also undermine the chance of overthrowing the regime, because if Russia decides that it's in its strategic interest to protect the Iranian regime, then we really are facing a very different battlefield for the Iranian people going forward. But first, just to the question of specifically about Russia, I mean, I guess you said at the outset you don't think that there's much Israel can do, but Egypt
Well,
has been increasing its arms purchases. I think the Saudis have as well from the Russians, and what can we do to diminish this mutual reliance, if you will?
yeah, this is where the American absence of power or purpose really matters. But I think Israel still has some sway over Moscow on some level. The red lines have to be redone. Israel has to, I think, quite frankly, talk with it has to have a very frank conversation with Moscow and basically say that there are a series of expanded red lines right now because you're expanding your cooperation with the Iranians, and Russia would have to understand that the realm of what Israel's prepared to do to uphold those red lines, make it in Russia's interest to come to some sort of an understanding with Israel again. Again, I think Israel frequently underestimates its own leverage. Israel can do immense damage to Russia's position in the Middle East. It can frankly terminate it if necessary. It can be a little costly for Israel, but Israel can devastate Russia in the Middle East. So I think ultimately the balance lies with Israel if Israel's willing to assert itself in that way. The survival of the Assad regime is a question. The survival of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is, by the way, I can't still to this day understand this Lebanon-Israel agreement over oil and gas. Because to me, the Hezbollah right now is in its most vulnerable position. The Iranian regime and the Iranian interaction with Russia becomes fair game. Flights, aircraft, airports in Iran, and so forth, that these planes land. In general, Russia's entire position in the Middle East can be threatened by Israel. And I think Russia is, at this point, not willing to live with those they're going to expand whatever relations and interactions with Iran they can to whatever is allowed them by Israel, in my view. But if Israel draws strong red lines, then I think Russia may abide by some. And if I were Israel, I'd focus on the nuclear program and its defense. The drones are, of course, dangerous, but Israel has answers for those drones, and those drones are in part not really just Israel's problem. I mean, there are those that are flying to Israel, that could fly to Israel and hurt Israel, but ultimately Europe has to answer the Russian drone threat, even if it's built in Iran, and they have to take into their hands the questions that Israel asks, which is, do you really want to continue not to have a kinetic policy or a sabotage policy against Iran? So I think Europe has the responsibility for its commitments to Ukraine now to begin to take down Iran's arms program internally. But Israel has to focus on those things that threaten Israel the most, and that obviously is the nuclear program and the missile programs. So Israel has to draw red lines with Russia on those and make it quite clear they're willing to strike where it really hurts Russia if they act, if they don't act to stop that trade. And
Yeah, there's this story that
that may include at some
there's
point telling the Russians, listen, I mean, if we have things that can hurt you and Ukraine, and if you hurt us enough, all bets are off on Ukraine.
well, I think we're very lucky that Netanyahu is coming back into power because he both had developed a very close and I wouldn't say friendly um, relationship with Vladimir Putin during his previous terms in office, and that'll be very useful now. And also because I think that people take us more seriously, and my sense is that we got two pieces of news over the past week that I thought were pretty significant. The first one was that Netanyahu had a 12-minute conversation with Turkish President Erdogan, and that was their first conversation since 2013. And that's significant, very significant, because Turkey's right there near Iran, and also, and I think relatedly, Azerbaijan just announced that they're opening up an embassy in Tel Aviv. I think actually the timing of it was sort of deliberate, that they announced it while the outgoing government is still in power so that it doesn't look like they're looking towards Netanyahu. But I think that it's fairly clear that they didn't open it before because they were waiting to see what happened politically. At any rate, I think that the increased intimacy between Israel and Turkey on the one hand, and Azerbaijan, which is where Israel and Turkey have acted in strategic alliance on behalf of Azerbaijan in its war against Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, that can have implications for a future operational cooperation in relation to Iran. And when you look at Netanyahu's very concerted outreach during the campaign to Saudi Arabia, where he's repeatedly said that he wants to expand Israel's ties to Saudi Arabia in his coming government, I think that you can look at this as a skeleton of an operational alliance against Iran. What are your thoughts?
Yes, and I think that's the ultimate answer to the Russian-Iranian strategic relationship is Israel has to now go full tilt, not only on dealing with Iran's nuclear program and its missile program, but in regime change. I think we've gotten to the point now where the Iranian people have made it clear they are after regime change. Almost to the last Iranian is now clear that they want regime change. They are braving bullets, stunning pictures as to what they're willing to do to confront tanks and aircraft. Uh, but the world is quiet. I mean, they're condemning it, but they're saying weird things like we're concerned and call on the Iranian government to respect peaceful demonstrations. There are no peaceful demonstrations anymore. This is a revolution. This is an armed response by the Iranian government without restraint, cruel and brutal to no end of imagination. It's really imperative now for Israel to declare itself, and I think Eyal Hulata's, the National Security Advisor's speech this morning, or the speech on Sunday, pretty much outlined that Israel now is in a regime change strategy. Well, to do that means that Israel has some real options that it needs to start pursuing in terms of the Iranian opposition and what it's prepared to do to help them on the basis of what they're asking for. One thing, though, as a caveat, one really has to be careful about trying to weaken the Iranian regime through separatism. This isn't anymore about weakening and controlling the Iranian regime. It's about bringing it down. And in that sense, the Iranian regime is trying to make the case that the Azerbaijanis, the Kurds, the Ahwazi Arabs, the Baloch, are all trying to separate, and it's the Iranian regime is suppressing them to keep Iran together, and that they're really acting in the national Persian Iranian interest. So it's very important that Israel not play into that and make sure that the help they give is anchored to the idea of changing the regime, not separating or weakening it. And I think it'll go a long way. Israel has a lot of options it can do. The nature of the Iranian Revolution has fundamentally changed in the last week. It was a revolution since day one. The people who say, no, it was first just a hijab demonstration, they were not listening. The demonstrators from day one said they were done. They were done with the regime. But now it's serious enough that people are taking note. So
Why?
this is
Because of what happened in Ramadan, you mean? That
well,
the
Hamadan. I
massacre
think
in Ramadan?
what Hamadan and the fact that they're using armored vehicles and helicopters and so forth is, of course, a big change. But I think already a week or two ago, you started seeing a lot of Iranians understand that they can't anymore just demonstrate. They can't put pressure on the government to collapse. They were after collapse, but they thought with enough mass demonstrations they could bring it down. What they began to realize is no, those IRGC officers that faced them, they are their enemy. They're not Iranians anymore in their eyes. And that you attack them, you disarm them, you shoot them
Kill
if
them.
necessary. So you have seen the violence increase. Then earlier in the week, you started seeing the revolutionaries targeting key regime symbols to humiliate the regime and rattle it, burning down Khomeini's house, burning down the Qom seminary, burning down seminaries all over. Now they're burning down the banks, especially those that are tied to the IRGC. So they're hitting the regime where it really now begins to cut into the regime's image and power and money and finances. And this is the sort of stuff that then causes the regime in despair to react. But one has to remember this means the regime is in deep trouble. This is the moment of truth now.
Do you know, I mean, one of the aspects of this that is notable is that we say they of the revolutionaries, but we don't have names. We don't have a leadership. I don't know if they have a clear leadership. And in the absence of a clear leadership, how can this continue to go forward as more and more people get killed? I know, I mean, there are a lot of comments, and I've seen on among the Iranians that I've been following on Twitter for the past 8 weeks or so. And they say that, they killed 35, according to one of the press reports that I saw in Hamadan on Saturday night, um, and that for every person that they kill, another 10 rise up, so that you kill 35, you get 350. And that may or may not be true, but it's leadership is very important, and it's not clear to me how that works here. And
Yeah,
do you have any thoughts on that?
leadership is important. I think there is a leadership in Iran emerging locally in each area that you see some intelligence and strategic thinking regionally going on. But more than that, I'm pretty sure that by the nature of things, we can't identify who those leaders are. We don't even see them. But there does seem to be a local leadership emerging everywhere. That's number one. Number two, externally, I think the West has discouraged the rise of any leaders. I mean, anytime you raise the name of the Shah, Western leaders would and Western intelligence organizations all just dismissively snickered at you, and it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. They just decided the Shah. They just didn't take him seriously. They didn't
You're
take
talking about
seriously
the Shah in 1979 or the Shah's son today?
the Shah's son today. Um, they didn't take Ali Najad, Masih Ali Najad seriously. They thought, well, she's a nice, funny, not funny, but she's a nice sort of image of women's rights in Iran. But they didn't take her seriously as a leader. Or Nazanin Bonyadi. They kind of dismissed these people as unserious because they weren't of the Washington insider crowd. Now, of course, the Washington insider crowd were Iranians that were basically shilling for the Iranian government to influence U.S. policy. And their whole purpose was to discredit an external leadership and to say they're not really Iranians. They're not really representing Iranian people. We saw this, by the way, in the Cold War, too. Is access to Iran and access to Russia, access to Moscow, and access by commentators and analysts and expatriates to Moscow became a currency for being a valid expert in Washington. Of course, they shilled for the Soviet government. People like Dan Pipes and others who couldn't go to Russia got it right and
Richard
predicted the
Pike.
fall. Richard Pipes,
Richard
sorry.
Richard
Uh,
Pike.
his father, that's right, not Daniel. Richard. Uh, got it right and were ignored. So they predicted the fall of the Soviet Union because they were honest. They did, but that came at an expense. You weren't treated as a genuine uh, scholar with insider knowledge of Russia at the time. Well, you had the same thing with the Iranians. So I think what you'll see over time is they will begin to fill that void. But that said, these revolutions often don't have a single focal point to succeed. The American Revolution, it's a bit different, but only about a third of the Americans actually supported the American Revolution. And then there were all these various leaders, some of which disagreed with each other considerably. But still, there was, George Washington already in 1775 was sort of commander of the forces. I think you'll see that emerge among the Iranians, but that if we're serious about Iran, we will help the Iranian opposition organize into a proper structure, a provisional government with command and control over defecting units,
You know,
with weapons
one
and other assets flowing into Iran, instead of us sitting
I
on the sidelines and sabotaging and snickering at them.
Well, that's what the Americans are doing, and I was talking to a colleague the other day about, what could be done, and his sense was that, this bringing down the Iranian regime is a huge undertaking, and that we'd really need, I mean, that this would be a job for NATO and the United States, and how much can Israel do? And my argument was, well, Israel wouldn't be operating alone. We would be operating with the Turks. We would be operating with the Saudis, with the Egyptians and the UAE and others in the Azerbaijanis, um, and and so that there is an alternative form or structure of regional support for the Iranian people. Um, and it is always a question. This isn't a real alliance. It's not. There's no treaty, and it's very much interest based and transactional, as they said of Trump. But I mean, do you think that all of these disparate actors have enough of an interest in overthrowing the regime to work together to do
No,
to help? Because
I don't believe the United States does at this point. I mean, it has an
no, I'm not
interest.
talking
It
about the
doesn't.
United States. I wasn't talking about the United States. I was talking about the actors in the region. If
You
if
don't want
if
the
that
region.
could happen.
I personally think that other than some areas in Iraq and Azerbaijan and so forth, you really would. It'd be better not without the region. It would be. This has to be an Iranian effort, Iranian owned.
No, I didn't mean a war. Don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about a war. I'm not talking about active. I'm talking about just providing the support that the Iranians need. I mean, when they're in an armed insurrection against this regime that will indeed, I mean, it is, they're right that it is their enemy.
I
The
think it has to be.
IRGC is a dangerous terrorist organization with
Yes,
very, very heavy weapons to kill many, many, many people. So, if they want to overthrow it, they need significant weapons to kill many, many people inside of the regime. If this works, it's going to be a civil war. I mean, I think that's what you were getting at the outset, that this has moved to a kinetic stage. It's not demonstrations with women waving their hijabs, it's people getting killed and people killing.
it in the end it will. I'm not sure it'll be a civil war because I think once there really is a strong pushback, effective pushback beginning from the Iranian people, it'll snowball quickly. And people in the military, for example, will read the writing on the wall. And even maybe some IRGC people will start reading the writing on the wall and they'll switch sides. So I think the collapse would happen much quicker than people think. But it doesn't take, I don't really think having a large coalition of nations helping in any way is a good thing here because each will then help their faction of the Iranian opposition, will divide it, etc. If the United States owns this and helps on the basis of the Iranian people and it has a provisional government, I think the key here is to set up a provisional government and Western nations expel Iranian ambassadors and freeze Iranian assets and turn it over to the provisional government. All those assets over to the provisional government. And then the provisional government begins, perhaps with some American advisors. The Israelis can help. I'm not one of those that believe that just because the Israelis help, it discredits the opposition. I think at this point the Iranian people really don't care and want help from wherever they're going to get it. But and I think in the long run, it really behooves Israel to help as much as it can. But I think that with the structure moving in that direction of international support for the government in terms of recognition and delegitimization of the Iranian government, I think at that point you're going to start seeing real movement on the ground of units of the Iranian military. I mean, imagine for a moment if this provisional government ordered the military to stand down or to even protect the Iranian people against the IRGC. Will all units? No. There's been a political imposition. These are not independent flag rank officers. These are IRGC overlay imposed on the military. But the military feels there's still a lot of the military that feels oppressed by the IRGC. And they could easily, many of the officers, lower rank officers, can defect with their units, which then changes, that's the snowballing effect. So you could see all this happen, but for the moment, the first thing we have to do is for the West, with great clarity, say, we no longer recognize Iranian's government as Iranian. It is now an
Right. Well,
illegitimate government.
I guess my only quibble with what you're saying is not anything that you're saying, but the likelihood of this happening. I mean, I just, you still have the Biden administration, backing Rob Malley as the architect of its policies. You do indeed have these radical progressives who have been seated in all levels of the U.S. government and foreign policy apparatus, including, as you mentioned, in the Justice Department. So, in the CIA, in the FBI, in the Defense Department, in the State Department, in all of the relevant agencies, and so and in the White House. So you're not going to see this kind. I find the likelihood very low that you're going to see this sort of thing. And then I guess the last question that I wanted to ask you today is, so specifically to the question of, I believe, like you do, that the Rubicon has been crossed, and that the Iranian people aren't going to go back. And the sense here, I know, among the military, is that, well, we really sympathize with them, but they don't have a real chance at this. I mean, they didn't in 2009, and in all of the successive waves, and people aren't really willing to look at this as something that can actually end with the downfall of the regime. Much the same way, by the way, that the Israeli military didn't think that Mubarak would ever fall in Egypt. There's just a stasis in thinking that there's no way to change what is, and what is will be tomorrow, and they haven't learned even the lessons of the Arab Spring, that this is simply not the case.
The
Um,
cynicism,
so the
lack of imagination of the Israeli defense establishment is truly stunning, and it's really a threat to Israel's strategic strength in the long run.
So the question is, if we do have an incoming government that I dare say will be much more interested in, and even as you said, Eyal Hulata, who's the outgoing national security advisor, he already said he wasn't going to be continuing to serve in his position, which is probably a good thing. He was the genius who brought us the gas deal with Hezbollah, but he said that we're looking towards a regime change in Iran. So what would an Israeli supportive strategy for the Iranian people really look like?
I think a very overt
And again,
prime,
wait, let me just
prime
one last thing before I let you talk. And this again is understanding, or with the assumption, that the United States is not going to be playing a helpful role here going forward, and neither is Europe for that matter.
I think Israel has to understand it's a regional power without peer. The Iranians are the only real threat to it. And what do I mean by that? If the prime minister of Israel, and this is where I am so thankful that Netanyahu will be the prime minister, because he talks beyond Biden, he talks beyond Washington, straight to the American people. He will have Congress and a number of people, Congress, listening to him on both sides of the aisle, mostly, of course, the Republicans, but there will also be a lot of Democrats still that will listen to him. I think the power that Netanyahu has in Washington and in America to bring America around on Iran is huge. The second thing is the impact on the Iranian people to see at least one powerful regional actor standing in their corner against the Iranian regime. Again, all these people who think that Israel's the kiss of death for the opposition are not listening to the opposition. Right now, the opposition, if they feel they have regional power in their camp, it will be like a shot of adrenaline for them. If it's added to it that the Saudis, the UAE, potentially Azerbaijan, and maybe a little bit the Turks, if possible, to bring them in operationally to help and to, I think that you have a powerful structure that will eventually bring Washington around to act. I think even before the administration changes, you could see events on the ground take over. If they see major congressmen in the United States say the sort of things that we were just talking about. The Prime Minister of Israel say those sorts of things. See the Israelis, the Saudis, the UAE, Bahrain, and so forth working actively together as a military structure. I think the Iranian opposition will feel so invigorated, especially if there then is real material aid given. I think at that point that can actually bring down the government. Again, these things aren't just counting bullets. It's like a war, and war is a momentum. And right now, the momentum still resides in the hands of the revolt, of the revolution. And the game right now is the Iranian regime is trying to change that momentum. I think that the linearness of this, namely that you would see a sloped decline of the government, doesn't work that way. At one point, a critical shift happens, and they go off a cliff. And the key right now for Israel is to keep the Iranian opposition as hopeful, as feeling not alone as possible. And that's why I think Prime Minister Netanyahu getting out there from day one, giving powerful speeches on Iran, Iranian history, Iranian affinity to Israel over the ages, Israel's opposition to their clerical regime, anything to suggest that Israel is in the camp of these people who are fighting in the streets, I think it can work. I think it can bring down the regime in the end.
All right. Well, on those sage words of wisdom, I think that we can say so long. I really appreciate, your insights. I think it's so critical that that the right people stand up now and help, because I think you said it first, that if the Iranian people are able to bring down this regime, it will be the most significant event in the Middle East since the establishment of the State of
Yeah,
Israel in 1948.
and
And the other thing, of course, is that what's that?
it could be the second most important strategic event globally since World War II. First being, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union.
Well, that's the other thing, is that I think that, going back to the first question that I was asking you about the Iranians and the Russians, I think that obviously if the regime falls, then that
Yeah,
will have that will have a positive impact on all kinds of things going
correct.
forward in Europe as well.
Correct.
All right. Well, listen, I thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining me this week. Thank you, and thank you guys for joining us this week. And I'll see you again next week for another Carolyn Glick show. Thanks so much.